that point, the PLO was headquartered in Lebanon. And there were conflicts between the PLO in Lebanon and the northern border of Israel, the northern part of Israel, the Galilee. I won't go into the details now, but in July 1981, what happens? Israel and the PLO agreed to a ceasefire. This is July 1981. And now Arafat is also careful to maintain the ceasefire. And then troubles begin already back then. In August 1981, guess what? That's what, how many years ago? About 30 years ago, right? No. Yeah, 25 years ago, a quarter of a century ago. The Arab League, in August 1981, it puts forth a two-state settlement of the conflict, exactly what they did in March 2002. Back then it was called the FAD, F-A-H-D, named after the Crown Prince, later King of Saudi Arabia. This time it was called, in March 2002, it was called the Abdullah, named after the Crown Prince who became the King of Saudi Arabia. It really is deja vu all over again. And now Israel panicked because they feared pressure was going to build on them to resolve the conflict. So what did they do? In September 1981, they step up preparations, not to destroy Hamas, it doesn't even exist back then, but to destroy the PLO. And we know exactly what happened. There's actually a very good book written by an Israeli strategic analyst. He's since passed away at Tel Aviv University. It's called The Dilemmas of Security. It's about that 1982 war. And he said, here's the problem. The problem was Arafat was ready to compromise with Israel, a two-state settlement. But he says all Israeli cabinets, as well as leading mainstream doves, opposed the Palestinian state in the West Bank. So what is Israel to do? He says they began to maneuver to sabotage the two-state settlement. How did they do it? He said they began to conduct punitive military raids, quote, deliberately out of proportion against Palestinian and Lebanese civilians in order to weaken PLO moderates, strengthen the hand of Arafat's radical rivals, and guarantee the PLO's inflexibility. If you keep killing civilians, then pressure is going to build on the PLO not to negotiate. So you try to radicalize them, and then when they become inflexible, then you can throw your hands up in despair and say, there's no one to negotiate with, which is Israel's favorite posture. But they had a problem. This nasty Arafat, he kept holding to the ceasefire. So what's Israel to do? Well, Mr. Yaniv, Professor Yaniv, the late Professor Yaniv says, Israel had only two choices. A political move leading to a historic compromise with the PLO, the two-state settlement, or preemptive military action against it. And as we know, Israel decided in the second action. It was not a pretty picture. Between June and September 1982, they killed between 18 and 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians. Well, why did they do it? Yaniv has a great expression. It always stood in my mind. He said the problem was the PLO's, Arafat's peace offensive. That was the problem. Those nasty, diabolical peace offensives. And he says, and now this will sound quite familiar to you at this point, he says the Israeli invasion of June 1982, quote, had been preceded by more than a year of effective ceasefire with the PLO. So what happened? Israel started, as it always does, its murderous provocations, the last of which it was launching all these attacks in South Lebanon, killed 200 civilians, including 60 occupants of a Palestinian children's hospital, and finally the PLO felt the pressure. It retaliated with some shells in the northern Galilee, killed a single Israeli, and then Israel had its pretext. It wasn't rocket attacks from on southern Israel. This time it was the shelling of northern Israel, what they called back then Operation Peace of the Galilee. That was the pretext, says Mr. Yaniv. What was the real reason? He says, quote, the real reason was, or as he puts it, the raison d'etre of the June 1982 war was destroying the PLO as a political force capable of claiming a Palestinian state on the West Bank. That was the problem. The problem was that two-state settlement. They claimed it was shelling from the north, just as they claimed recently it was rocket attacks from the south. But, well, let's see what happened. In December 2008, then Israeli Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni, she said that Israel wanted to create a temporary period of calm with Hamas, but she said not an extended truce, because if we have a long ceasefire with Hamas, it'll, quote, harm the Israeli strategic goal, empower Hamas, and give the impression that Israel recognizes Hamas. What does that mean in layperson's term? If you have a protracted ceasefire with Hamas, then you're going to enhance its credibility. And then pressure is going to build on Israel. Why don't you negotiate? They're willing to settle on the international terms for resolving the conflict. And that would, as Livni says, harm the Israeli strategic goal. That is to say, undermine Israel's strategic goal of retaining the West Bank. And so as far back as March 2007, Israel already decided on attacking Hamas. And it only negotiated a truce, and here the Israeli papers are very honest. They said Ehud Barak, then the defense minister, he only negotiated a truce, quote, because the Israeli army needed time to prepare the attack. Once all the pieces were in place, Israel only lacked a pretext. And it does as it always does. It provokes, and in retaliation ensues. This time, on November 4th, it was election day in the United States. All Americans' attention was riveted on the outcome of the election, and the Israelis choose November 4th to break the ceasefire by killing 7 Palestinian militants, knowing full well that that would result in a Hamas rocket attack, which would then give them their pretext. Again, the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs was remarkably honest. It said Hamas resumed its rocket attacks, quote, in retaliation after Israel killed the Palestinian militants on November 4th. And then Israel could embark, as it did, on yet another murderous invasion in order to foil yet another diabolical Palestinian peace offensive. That's pretty much what I have to say, and now I'll hear from you.